I will request that you go first. The way, the format that I propose to the three of you, if you agree, is if you present your first round of reflections, 10 minutes each. Then we open the floor for questions, and then finally, when Kopi leaves, we hand it back. We can say whatever we want. Is that fine?
Yes.
Okay. So over to you.
Okay. Actually, I got hijacked just 2 minutes ago. I was in that comfortable situation of thinking I'll just listen and go away. I'll give you.
Can you give the?
Yeah.
Yeah, just pick on it. You come on.
So, I thought I'll just be able to walk away without having to say anything, but but what I'll have to ask you to pardon me on is, since I'm just caught suddenly, I may end up saying a few things which are disjointed. But these are things I feel very passionate about, and that's why I'll sort of come out with them. Even if they are disjointed is fine. I mean, one, why are we talking mobility? I mean, what is mobility is all about? I mean, it's really connecting people to jobs, connecting students to education, connecting patients to healthcare, connecting goods from where they are produced to where they are sold. That's really the basic purpose of why we are talking mobility. I also tend to compare the mobility system with the circulatory system in the human body. The circulatory system in the human body is what moves nutrients from one part of the body to the other part of the body. That's what the mobility system in a city also does. And if your blood stops flowing, you're dead. Similarly, if in a city traffic comes to a standstill, the city is dead. That's the value of mobility. The way I see it, a lot of problems that you face with mobility, the solutions are not within the transport system. The solutions to my mind lie outside the transport system in the sense of how our cities are designed. We talked about mixed use planning. In fact, Geetam talked about mixed use housing. And I think mixed use housing could be a solution to a lot of the mobility problems that we are facing today. The other big challenge I see in mobility, which we need to think about is, or probably that has been discussed in some other contexts also, is this whole thing about institutional fragmentation. Massive institutional fragmentation, the metro company, bus company, the PWD, the people who do the traffic management, just don't talk to each other. What can we do about it? I've been fortunate in having had an opportunity to work in a number of other countries where very similar problems are being faced. And the questions that came up is, if you want to bring about integration, you must set up one institute which is responsible for transport in its entirety. There the challenge is, what do you do with institutions which are already in place and already well entrenched, and they will not like the idea of anyone stepping on their toes? Then the question that came is, well, what do you need this integration for? Is it on day-to-day operations? Or is it on a periodic planning exercise? Once you've done a periodic planning exercise and come up with what we tend to call a comprehensive mobility plan, or you could call it a strategic mobility plan, the implementation of the plan can be done by different agencies which are in place today. But can that be monitored, and it should be ensured that work is happening as per this plan by this single entity? Very often you'll find plans I've seen this happening in Delhi, plans have been prepared, all kinds of things have come up at the level of the chief secretary of the state, but then the metro company goes up with a proposal for a certain extension of the line and everything is forgotten and this is approved. So all that plan is gone. The way some cities have done it is, okay, if you have this one entity, you may have a law to back it up, you may have a law to say that it will have some kind of authority on the others. But that doesn't work. What works is, can the money be channeled through them? If you have all the money for mobility needs in a city channeled through this single entity, chances are all the others will listen to it. If money goes to some outside of this system, then this doesn't work. So this is, I mean, some thoughts on how these institutional fragmentation issue can be handled. One other thing that I would like to talk about, there seems to be a big interest in high cost, as I call them, toys in many cities. So a lot of cities, a lot of political leaders feel that they've been able to showcase something by getting a metro to their city. So apparently Meerut is now planning a metro system. Well, yes, Guwahati is planning a metro system. And I've seen this at the World Bank also, a lot of cities which really should be thinking of other alternatives, but the metro is the glamour thing which is coming in. And what we try to do there is, you can't battle that. You can't battle the need for the demand for a metro. If you can't battle that, the next best that you can possibly do is, well, do your metro right. If you're investing X in a metro, are you willing to invest 0.5x on a whole lot of other things that need to happen around the metro to make it worthwhile? Otherwise, you just put a toy there, and that toy hardly carries people. Now, I can give you any number of examples in India itself where this is happening. But at least can you do those other things around the metro so that it becomes a proper system? So I think these are some of the challenges we are facing here. I've just come from an annual urban mobility conference that happens in India every year. This time it was held in Ahmedabad. And some of the conversation I saw happening this time was a first for me. For example, people started saying, the minister himself said that, yes, the metro is fine, but it has to be your last option. You must look at other options before you look at the metro. I think we are soon beginning to realize that we are setting up far too many metros and we can't afford them. And tomorrow these have to be maintained, and the maintenance costs will kill us in terms of O&M. Let me leave it with these few disjointed comments, but I think...
Should I first challenge OP or say something else? Okay, let me start with this, what I was actually asked to talk about. SDGs, and especially transport SDGs, where this linkage is quite strong. And especially this time, out of 17, at least there are 7 SDGs which mention transport explicitly. And also in terms of 169 targets which have been set, 7 of them directly address transport issues and 5 of them indirectly. But I think first thing I'd like to bring to your attention is that 3 major things have been left out in these, even when the transport issues have been explicitly mentioned in SDGs. First, very important, is rural access has not been properly articulated in that. Logistics has not been articulated. In fact, right in the beginning, OP mentioned that, if there are people, of course, you need goods also. And interestingly enough, even in transport sector, on urban logistics, very little studies have gone into, actually documenting their all kinds of impacts. We have a lot of regulations about it, restrict their movement to enable passenger movement. But actually understanding what are the implications of doing this in terms of local pollution, global pollution, congestion, all those externalities, we don't understand very well at all. So this part should have been included in SDGs, and there are groups who have made representation that it should be included. Third, I think absolutely important thing which should have been recognized to transport is the role it plays as a cross-cutting issue. Because we are not having any slides here, otherwise I could show that at least in 13 SDGs, if you don't do transport, you cannot achieve those goals. And this goes because we talk about poverty. Of course, transport is very strongly related with that. Access to education, health, employment, economic development. This is all about access. This is all about providing affordable, sustainable access, which eventually translate to transport. So transport should have been recognized as one of those cross-cutting issues. Otherwise, actually achievement of many of the SDGs are not possible. Now, because we have only 10 minutes, so I would just like to mention 3 indicators which have been put together for transport. So one, they're talking about that we must halve road traffic injuries by 2030 as compared to 2010. Where does India stand in this? I think there is a big question mark. Looking at what is happening today, the way our policies are moving and the way our transport sector is moving, my expectation is we would double our deaths in next 5 years. Today we are killing 150,000 people every year, and there is absolutely nothing which is going to prevent it right now. I mean, the rates are also not reducing. We've looked at detailed numbers which are available from National Crime Record Bureau, which shows that there are the states like Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, the so-called good states, where a lot of development has taken place. The rate, so number of people dying per 100,000 population has become 3 to 4 times as compared to last 10 years. So it is not just absolute numbers, but even the rates are increasing, and it is the same story for cities also. NCRB publishes a number of deaths per 1 million cities which are more than 1 million population. And what is very interesting in that number is that regardless of city size, it is not just big cities, the small cities, cities in the north, east, west, no geographic distinction you can make out. Only thing, initial thing that we can make out is wherever a lot of investment has gone into transport sector or a major highway is passing close by, the number of deaths have increased 3 to 4 times in last 5 years. So I think if we have to meet this SDG goal, we really have to completely rethink our strategy. Second target, they have also put same thing for actually adverse reducing health impacts coming from air pollution in cities, which is of course closely PM10 and PM2.5. And I think what initial lot of studies are showing that we don't even understand this issue very well. It's not just transport, there are a lot of other sources. We don't have correct understanding of these sources. So unless we invest more time in understanding this, where are the solutions coming from? So right now, and I think something that Gautam mentioned this morning, there is this impatience amongst us, researchers and as well as policymakers. We are not willing to look into any long-term issues. We can make a roadmap. In 10 years, we can clean up cities. But we want solutions today. Delhi, after experiencing this smog, the minister puts out, give us 10 points that we can implement right now. Actually, the answer for that is nothing can be done in short term. But I think so this is again coming back to if we need to meet such targets, do we have patience and do we have that kind of, are we willing to invest that kind of resources to actually start understanding the details which are required? Interesting thing that I looked up in a recent number was, so in South Delhi, because the data is much better available for Delhi, the proportion of pollution which comes from tailpipe of vehicles is very small. So it's CNG buses running and maybe more efficient new fleet. But the dust particles which comes from resuspended dust because of movement of motorized vehicles is extremely high. So I think this is again making a very good connection. We can have clean fuel, we can have fuel efficient vehicles. But if we don't reduce motorized vehicles, we are not going to solve this problem. So I come back to this thing that are we ready for this uncomfortable decision? You said cities are willing to do metro because it is not touching the toes of cars. It is either underground or it is elevated. Cars are not being affected by construction of metros. And that is why in the name of public transport, those public transport are acceptable which don't touch the car. So I think this is the question then. You said, okay, metros will happen and we shouldn't question, go ahead with it. No, I'm not. it is just a bigger, some question we need to ask ourselves, are we ready for uncomfortable decisions? And my understanding so far is we are not. So, and then last thing that I would like to mention is that the news census, which has given numbers, how people travel in Indian cities, and it gives you for small cities, all kinds of cities. Urban district, actually, the question is for urban district, how people travel to work. And 2 or 3 very striking numbers have come out which we didn't understand very clearly. About 20 to 30% people have reported they don't travel to work at all. So the trips are so small, they are not counted as trips. At least those people have not counted them as trips. The biggest proportion, regardless of city size, is walking trips. So very often we find this, as cities grow, people cannot travel, people cannot walk, and of course you have to invest in other things. But what this number is showing is that our city formation is very different. It is not what I would call a sprawl. It is basically many cities geographically, compactly placed together. So every individual is not making long trips. That's why they are able to walk. And the third striking number which struck me was that number of people commuting by train, not metro, and number of people commuting by car. So actually number of people commuting by train in this overall cities is much higher than number of people traveling by car. And I have not seen any discussion on passenger trains, improving passenger trains, which is being used by so many people. In small cities, in Patna, I saw the number is 14%. In West Pargana district, it's 20%. There is no discussion of this. So we talk about this indicator, public transport within 500 meters and every 20 minutes frequency. This is what is SDG. But we already have this. And we don't want to recognize it. And there is no discussion about improving it. So last thing is that we have captive users of public transport, of walking and bicycling. And the challenge, if we need to meet SDG, is to retain this, not to attract more people. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's I would say an honor to be sitting next to OP and Geetam. Geetam used to be a teacher many, many years back, 20 years back. Many people think that there are some differences of opinion between Geetam and me, but the truth is that we have more in agreement than differences. So I think we should. So let's acknowledge the agreements, because we have far more in agreement than the differences that we might have. I don't consider myself to be a transportation expert. And I think I want to add one more to the SDG. This is subject to all these countries coming together. They've already debated and agreed on 17 SDGs, and I'd suggest a 18th SDG, and that should be on the issue of addiction. And you asked me, what addiction? And I say, addiction to the idea of a car. We are just crazy. So addicted we are that we can't even think of a world without a car. That needs to keep going on. And everything else, maybe we'll do it on the side. So we need to stop thinking about car as a start. We should stop thinking about cars, period, and start thinking about everything else. So let's start really there. The next point is our fixation when it comes to urban mobility on rail transit, and specifically the toys that OP was speaking about, monorails and metros. Maybe metros make sense to a certain extent in some places, but they have a limited role. Truth be told, if you look at cities across the world, rail plays a very small role in urban transportation. Or even if it does play an important role, it's much less than what a bus does. So you take London. How many people here know how many kilometers of rapid transit or rail transit London has, Greater London? Any guesses? 1,800 kilometers. 1,800 kilometers. And yet, those 1,800 kilometers only transport 1/3 of the total public transportation ridership in the city. 2/3 is by bus. Now, ask the same question of Paris, the same answer comes. Ask the same question of Delhi, which has the largest amount of metro that we have in an Indian city, 200 kilometers, it's the same answer. It's actually more by bus than by rail. Ask Mexico City, which has 400 kilometers of rapid transit in another developing country, the answer is the same, 20% by rail, 80% by bus. Singapore, Hong Kong, all these countries which are known for their rail transportation, they have more by bus than rail. So we cannot have a public transportation system unless we talk bus. Maybe there's a role for rail, but there is definitely a larger role for bus. And the next point is, we far too often think only transit. And even with SDGs, a lot of focus is on transit. And I say that, you cannot have transit without walking and cycling. Just not possible. So transit without walking and cycling is meaningless. And then the next point, as Geeta already told us, that half the trips of trips that happen are actually on walk and cycle. And then you cannot have transit, walk and cycling unless we get to the point of addiction or de-addiction. So TWC without TDM essentially being cutting car use, is meaningless. So let's face it, we need to do it. And all of these are meaningless unless we create transit-oriented cities or we have the right kind of urban planning. So I don't want to call it transit-oriented development in a very small way as it's come to be misused, as the term has been misused. And finally, a transit-oriented city is meaningless unless we address the issue of housing, which we did yesterday. So all these need to really come together. So I suggest that we really think about the whole business of mobility under 4 principles, that we need to get it right when it comes to environment, and a lot of talk has been about environment, good, but we also need to talk about transportation from a perspective of equity and access. And we need to talk about transportation from a perspective of safety and security. And finally, we also need to look at transportation from the perspective of efficiency. Are we being resource efficient? Are we being time efficient about how we do things? So if you take off from there, then the real goals, there are 5 goals, in my opinion. Maybe there are more, but 5 principal goals. First is vehicle kilometers traveled, VKT. We have to stabilize our VKT at present levels, period. If we are in a mess right now, we cannot make the mess larger than what it is right now. So which means that by 2026, we need to have same or less absolute number of vehicle kilometers traveled on our streets, in spite of the increased population, which means that we need to increase rapid transit. And that brings me to the goal of PNT, which I briefly spoke about, people near transit. And we need to really aim at some dramatic numbers, numbers upwards of 80%. So if you look at cities like Paris, can anyone guess what the PNT of Paris is? Any guesses? It's 100%. So are we willing to go in that direction or not? And what is the right number for us? Also keeping in mind that we need to have walking and cycling not just as access modes to transit, but as modes by themselves. Then the issue of fatalities. And just to put things in context, Bangalore, or let's say Chennai and Paris, again, are similar sized cities. Do you know how many people died in Chennai last year on streets? It was 4 every day. There were like 1,400 people who died on the streets of Chennai. And that number is not unique because it's on an average in Indian cities, we kill about 150 people for every million inhabitants, 150. Now compare that to Paris, which is somewhat of a good example, had a total of 40 people who died on streets. And Paris is not unique. cities which have taken action on this have 1/20th or less the number of fatalities than we have. So an SDG of half is meaningless. What you really need to be talking about, 20th of what we have right now, given where we are starting. And then the issue of ambient air quality, I don't want to dwell more upon it, already been said. And then the issue of also trip length. We got to stabilize our trip lengths. We can't let there be a sprawl, and we need to create our urban plan or our urban development such that people don't actually travel too long. Whether it's these multiple cities within a city or however it works out, we need to make sure that happens. And for all these, we really need to look at what are those input metrics. And some basic calculations that we've done suggests that we need to start with walking and cycling, and we need to have at least about 80 kilometers of complete streets per million population. We have pretty much 0 right now in our cities. Some cities might have 5 kilometers of complete streets per million population, but we pretty much are at zero. We need about 500 to 600 buses per million population. So Bangalore, with 9 million people, is actually doing a slightly better than that number, but it should probably have even more. But as a minimum, we need to have about 600 buses. So Bangalore is about the same. So it's about 6,000 buses, and Bangalore has about 6,000 operational buses. But most of our cities are not there. Most of our cities are less than 10 buses, less than 100 buses per million population. And then finally, rapid transit, where it makes sense. And it makes sense in cities which are larger than 1 million or thereabouts. We need about 20 to 25 kilometers of rapid transit. Now, this rapid transit doesn't need to be rail. This rapid transit can be by bus. So you can have great bus rapid transit serving the needs of cities of India. A bit of a comparison again, we talk about BRICS, Brazil, China, India, peers, bank, whatnot. China and Brazil have 4 times as much rapid transit as we have today. France is off the charts. France has 30 times more than us. But the more disconcerting part of it is that China and Brazil are also building rapid transit at 4 times the rate at which we are building. Are we ready to ramp up and ensure that we actually get rapid transit to our people? Are we ready to make a PNT 100 city rather than a PM 2.5 city? And with that, I'd like to stop now so that we can have some questions and discussion.
Thanks in absentia, OP, and Geetam and Shiv. Very provocative. I suggest we take a round of questions, and then you guys can sort of answer.
Like in many senses, if I can just say this, in many senses we need to turn around this mythical pyramid where we presently put at the pinnacle a car. We need to completely turn it around and put walking at the top and car at the bottom. That's what we need to do.
How pedestrian?
So, what's going to be the effect of Uberization, electric cars, and self-driving cars that we are expecting to see in the next 10 years on mobility?
Well, that's the. Oh, sure. Sorry.
Yeah, I just, I'm sorry if this sounds a little rhetorical, but one thing is pretty clear is that promoting walkability and bicycle paths in cities is obviously going to actually touch or enable a number of SDGs. Because you can think of air pollution, you can think of reduction of some amount of GHGs, you can think of improvements in health and access and all those kinds of things. But actually, even in enlightened circles, when this discussion, and I always raise it, but causes a lot of disagreements. And I actually think since there is a lot of conversation about the word, about transformative change, which itself has become a cliche because we don't know where to go beyond just the word, this, really walkability and cycling have to be, obviously, I think, a very fundamental part in thinking about cities. But I don't find that in any of our thinking or conversations regarding cities, even among those who are actually working on urban mobility. Not always, I mean, in some groups I do. But I was wondering where one would start and how the stumbling blocks are. Are they simply in one's imagination and vision, or are they actually simply political will, or is it a combination, or do we just have to show that it's feasible? Demonstration of feasibility often is very helpful both to people and to, say, decision makers and others. So then should we be thinking about particular models, say small, medium size cities in India? Is that the starting point?
I just have a short point to make, and I make this often in transport meetings, that it's a plea, basically, to stop using the word mobility altogether when we're talking about transportation. Because the word mobility sort of conjures up these kinds of metaphors about circulation of blood through the body, that somehow mobility and movement is necessary and essential for a city to function. No, it isn't. Access is what is important. And so let's sort of stop talking about mobility. Let's talk about transportation in terms of access, as many transportation planners have suggested in the past. So I just sort of thought I had to say that.
One quick observation. I kind of am glad that Geetam has said that we are already there. I do agree with you that I mean, when I look at the public transportation system in Hyderabad, very large percentage of people actually use the public transportation, the buses. A very large number of people use the semi-public transportation, which is the auto rickshaws. And we don't seem to be at all talking about what we already have and what we need to do with that. But one of the things that always surprises me about debates on transportation and transportation policy is the complete silence on the people who actually provide the transportation services. In Hyderabad, you have 150,000 auto rickshaws, which means that you have 150,000 people. And if we take an average family size of 4, you're talking about 10% of the city's population actually depending on the income from providing transit services in the city. And add to that the buses, add to that all the other things, it's a huge number, and they never seem to be figuring anywhere in our policy discussions or in the way in which we talk about transportation at all.
Namani, quick question.
Yeah. Just I want to know how many rapid bus transport system has implemented in India, in the cities, and then how many got failure. And then I would like to know whether do we have a last mile connectivity and whether we have a feeder connectivity, because we are talking about the rapid transport system, mass transport system, and then we don't have a feeder connectivity to that to connect the last mile. So we need to address those things, and I would like to know the rapid bus transport system.
Can you wait for let them first respond to this, and then we do a
Hello. Okay. So the first question was Uberization and Olaization of India and electric vehicles and whatnot. I think also falls under the same category of addiction. We're still talking car, and we're still talking our fascination with technology and somehow how technology will solve the world. The truth is, technology is not going to solve the problems. It's a question of public policy. Transportation is really a question of what do we want to prioritize, what's the right thing to do, not which technology will do it. Technology has a role to play. It can facilitate once you've decided what that direction is, but it's not going to answer the question. Having said that, shared mobility, we should really be talking about a larger set called shared mobility and not just Ola and Uber. Ola and Uber are closest in that spectrum of shared mobility to a car, to a personal car. The other end is actually the shared auto rickshaw, which we have in our cities. And Ola or Uber does around 10 to 12 person trips in a day. A shared auto rickshaw, on the other hand, does about 100 to 120 person trips a day. Same amount of road space occupied, but dramatically different results in how people are moved. So we need to look at any transportation mode against those 4 principles that I spoke about. Is it environmentally sound? Is it equitable and accessible? Is it safe and secure? And is it efficient? And if the answer is more yes, then it's the more right answer. If it's mostly no, then it's not the right answer going forwards, which means that we need to have a very clear policy on shared mobility as to which parts of it are going to take us to the right future and which ones will not, and therefore which ones need to be dissuaded and which ones need to be promoted. The second question, walking and cycling ignored. Where do we start? Cities are starting to do it. I wouldn't say that they've gotten it, but our little experience in working with a few cities, Chennai, Coimbatore, and Pune, all these cities have fairly extensive programs of now retrofitting their streets with nice wide footpaths to ensure that there's good walking environment. But it's not just about footpaths, it's also about crossings, for example. You need to have a crossing, the ability to cross the street every 150 meters or thereabouts. The shorter the distance, the better, which means that we need to get rid of this mentality of signal-free streets. We need to have signal-full streets rather than signal-free streets. And so Chennai is moving forward. So Chennai now has a non-motorized transport policy, which says that walking and cycling is its priority over other things. That 60% of its transportation budget will be spent on walking and cycling infrastructure and other initiatives to promote it. That they do have a Vision Zero, whether they're achieving it or not, that's to be monitored, but at least they have a statement of intent, which is a good starting point. And they are already doing the process of retrofitting about 480 streets in the city. Similarly, Pune is going forward. It has now designs being actively developed for about 100 kilometers in the city. Coimbatore, again, is doing a bunch of streets, I think about 30 kilometers in all. But these are not alone. There are other cities which are also doing it. So I think there's a start. But the big question is, are we also willing to manage parking? Because unless we manage parking and vending as well, and I'm not saying vending is bad, actually vending is good, but it needs to be managed vending. We will not have successful walking and cycling environments. Very right about your point about stopping the use of the word mobility and to talk about access, 100% with you. About already people using transit, great, but the truth is it's reducing. It's not increasing. Like the fact of the matter is that we have a 7% to 8% annual growth of personal motor vehicles, which means that something's giving. So, and there's a clear attraction. So we need to do something about it, and we also need to do something about the quality of whatever we have. We can't let just the fact that 50% of people are walking or cycling doesn't mean that they are doing that in great environment, and that they would continue to do so if the environment continues to be the same. So let's make sure that they get the right infrastructure, the right systems. And lastly, about transit, and the question really was, I think, a slightly veiled question about bus rapid transit failure, and maybe the question was even about Delhi. And I would say BRT did not fail in Delhi. Delhi failed in BRT. It just failed. It did not know how to prioritize public transportation over private motor vehicles, and continues to be in that frame of mind. We need to prioritize rapid transit. If we do, then we'll get the right results. If we don't, then we will not.
How does this become, yeah. So it's a good thing many cities are talking about it. But the other side also I keep seeing, for example, you know that UTPAC guidelines have been done for like 3-4 years now. So UTPAC guidelines in Delhi have all the right things, how the complete roads should be done. Details are given. But what do you see on the road? Completely opposite. They have no meaning. And this is when it has been so-called approved by DDA. All PWD roads should be doing that, but it's not happening. So I think in terms of access and mobility, this is our challenge. We are actually completely preoccupied with mobility. If there is a congestion, first thing you do is get rid of pedestrian path, make more space for cars. So first thing that Shreya said, you know, car addiction, that is, I guess, a #1 challenge. Because we want to do, you know, you already mentioned this Delhi project also, how people call it a failure. It is because it benefited public transport users and it inconvenienced car users. So we want to call a successful project, a public transport project is successful, where it should not inconvenience car users. That is our yardstick. So if this kind of challenge we are dealing, you know, so where are we going ahead with SDGs? I think it's a real uphill task. We don't have good answers for it right now.
No, I just had a comment that one of the main things which we notice in all the cities is that we have, in the past 10 years, all these schools are running private buses. And you see all the peak hour traffic because of school kids' buses going from one end of the city to the other end. Whereas if you see abroad, each city, for example, Adelaide and cities in UK, they have said that if a school is located in a particular area, that particular area's children have to go to that school. They cannot go to a school in an area 20 kilometers away. So one solution, of course, we need to have the necessary ordinances and people's will, is that the school should be in that particular area. Same thing applies for workplace. And why should a person have to go to 20 kilometers away? Sorry? It has that? It has implemented? The catchment schools? Yeah. But other cities, we don't see this. Same thing with the private universities that are coming up. Private universities are located 20 kilometers away from the city, and all the kids have to go by buses every day. We are seeing a lot of private buses being run by private colleges. So I think somewhere that needs to be. And one more comment which I had, I think water transport may be considered for some of the cities, you know, all the coastal cities, water transport may be an option. Bombay is considering it. So, thank you. Yeah. So if you
I'm a little bit disappointed with the group, except that Geetam talked about that started with rural access. The whole issue when you talk about transportation, it's all urban centric, either metro or this one. I'm a little bit concerned about it because when Delhi declared that, okay, all the old cars should be taken out from here, immediately all these things are imported in Assam and other places in interior, polluting the place. It affects all my SDGs. Whatever you name it, it's affect all the SDGs. I'm sure the people from Northeast will know. All the cars which have been, the Siddharji's had in here, it's all been imported there and then started running. One. Second thing is, we talk about only about the passenger movement. What about the commodities? The amount of pollution that is generated by the trucks that comes in and out of the city, as well as within the rural area, it generates more pollution than whatever we can think of. Okay, it affects directly the climate policy of the thing. Third, the bullock cart which you used to see in the rural areas, now slowly gone into, now the recent thing wherever I go, I see only that e-rickshaws. And that too, I'm glad that they are going for solar rickshaws. Okay, but if the density increases and there is no maintenance and other thing, do we have any transport policy which covers all these aspects? Especially when I go down from the metro to the secondary and the third level, it's only the private operators. So what kind of transport policy we have which restricts the longevity or the usage of this particular thing and promote that kind of land use and other thing in the lower order settlement, including villages? Thank you.
Last one.
Very interesting sort of discussions. There's this whole question of whose interests are being served and whose interests are going to be hurt. In each of our sort of SDGs and mechanisms and way forward, etc., I think that's a very critical question if we are to even begin to strategize. Because there's a certain discourse which we are following here, and I think everybody accepts a certain basic logic about the need. It's aspirational, we need to do a variety of things. There are large number of examples available, not only to us, but also to policymakers, decision makers. But there's great reluctance to implement, and that's precisely because somebody's economic interests are being hurt. And I think when we are looking at SDGs, this is something that we probably also need to look at in order to strategize our way forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, in fact, in the earlier round also there was a question on IPT which somehow it skipped. And then Professor Sridharan brought out this point again. It is true. So yes, this question of our so limited myopic thinking about big cities. And clearly when you impose ban, obviously those vehicles are going to pollute somewhere else. So that's what initially I mentioned, instead of doing this long-term roadmap, what needs to be done, after careful understanding, there just doesn't seem to be any space for that anymore, that kind of discussion and debate. So you want immediate solutions. We can have even an odd, we can ban these cars immediately, don't worry about freight vehicles, ban it. Where is it leading to? We have banned, that we have banned even these local fires that poor people have to do because of cold weather. Is banning a solution? So I think, especially in terms of SDGs now, we have to do at least this community has to do some careful thinking that we have to move away from this myopic style of working. And IPT, absolutely, and you mentioned whose interests are being hurt. So that is what, it all comes back to this issue of, really powerful car industry. Everybody knows about it. But, the moment we talk about bicycle and pedestrians, yeah, but there is no road space, how can we do it? That is not the question at all. You always have 3 meter space. It's how you want to use it and who will get adversely affected. So I think overall, I think it's a real, again, I'm repeating that, it's a real uphill task and we need to do some real hard thinking if we want to achieve these SDGs.
So first of all, to Professor Sridharan, apologies because we did not touch on the issue of rural transportation and freight transportation, which is not to say that they were not very important. Definitely yes. I would like to say something about the shared auto rickshaws, and I had mentioned that earlier. So when we, presently many states and even the national government is considering creating what they call an aggregator policy. But it's a very myopic way of looking at the issue of shared mobility, because aggregator is only looking at the Ola and Uber and saying, how do you maybe regulate it? But you need to be really looking at this entire spectrum, which also includes shared auto rickshaws as a means of transportation. And when you talk about shared mobility, actually, even bus is shared mobility, even metro is shared mobility. And so the differentiation is between public shared mobility and private shared mobility. And public is where the government is saying, okay, I do take some responsibility for it. So if I run a bus, that's public shared mobility. Private shared mobility is where the government just washes off its hand and says, whatever happens, happens. Or maybe I'll even get some money out of it, through licensing. Like the Blue Line buses were essentially a private shared mobility mode. It just happens to be a bus, but it's no different from a shared auto rickshaw for the most part, where the government basically washed off its hands and said, you do whatever you can and give me a certain royalty on me letting you run the service, rather than saying I'm responsible for the accessibility of citizens. and shared auto rickshaws really are very large. Like we work in many smaller cities. Ranchi is one example where it's just unbelievable. There are 28% of the trips in the city are by what I would want to call public transportation. But almost all of it is by shared auto rickshaws. So something like 8 lakh trips a day happen on public transportation, of which 20,000 are by bus, and 7,80,000 are by shared auto rickshaws. And that's true in all our cities of that size. So in truth be told, except for the the top 10, 12 cities, the rest of the cities have essentially shared auto rickshaws. And even the larger cities like Hyderabad, Chennai, dramatic numbers like 50 lakh trips every day by bus, 10 lakh trips by rail, 15 lakh trips by shared auto rickshaws. So even these cities do not have enough public transportation, and that's why shared auto rickshaws came into being in the first place. So we need to talk about how do you facilitate it. There needs to be a certain amount of regulation as well. They should have safety standards. They should have emission standards. But we should also talk about how do you facilitate that. And finally, the question of what we call an investment versus what we call a subsidy. When we create a flyover, we call it an investment. When we have to pay the deficit of a public transportation operator, we call it a subsidy. When it's exactly the opposite. You should make an investment into public transportation and you're subsidizing the use of personal motor vehicles. And we did some calculations in Tamil Nadu and we found that for every bus passenger trip that happens, the government gives 90 paise per trip, effectively. Can you guess how much the government subsidizes personal car trip? 31 rupees. So what are we talking about?